Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm going to move the microphone a little closer. That fan might be a little loud. I apologize for that, but it's a little warm outside. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm taking a trip down memory lane, and we're going to discuss the Zelda franchise, the Legend of Zelda franchise. Because I've got some complicated and mixed feelings in regards to Zelda as a whole. So let's start at the beginning. Zelda originally made its appearance, in the US at least, on the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was a new type of game at the time. There wasn't anything really like it. It was a top-down action-adventure game with very loose RPG elements. Very loose RPG elements. It was essentially a considerably more advanced iteration of a game on the Atari 2600 known as Adventure. It's played very similarly. You start out with nothing, literally nothing. You're dropped in the wilderness. And the very first thing you do is you talk to a, we'll say NPC, who gives you your sword, your weapon. And then you go on your quest. Your basic quest is to kill monsters and collect currency in the game called rupees. And then you go to shops and you trade rupees for items. Bow and arrows, bombs, keys, an upgrade to your shield, things like that. And other random items that are necessary for completing the game. So you have two areas of gameplay. Two different distinct gameplay methods in The Legend of Zelda. You have the overworld wilderness exploration aspect of the game, where you're just basically wandering around the map, looking for secrets, looking for treasures and items, exploring, just, wandering around. And then the second aspect is when you come across a door, usually as a part of a fortress or something similar, and you go inside the door and you find yourself in the dungeon, and now you're in the second aspect of Legend of Zelda gameplay. Dungeon exploration. Within each dungeon, you have a few things that are standard. You have a map, you have keys that open locked doors, you have to explore, you have monsters, you have puzzles to solve. There's always a boss somewhere in the dungeon. There's always a treasure item, which is necessary for exploring previously unexplorable parts of the map, as well as useful in other dungeons. And there's always a Triforce piece, which the main goal of the game is to collect all the pieces of the Triforce, kill the big bad boss, Ganon, and rescue Zelda, who is the princess that the game is named after. Put the Triforce pieces back together and restore peace to the land. That's the gist of the game. Incredibly primitive by today's standards. But still holds up really well as a classic retro 8-bit NES game. One of the better games on the 8-bit NES. I first discovered The Legend of Zelda when I was, I want to say, 5 or 6. I think I was in first grade, so I might have been 7. Yeah, I was probably 7. So, yeah, because I was in first grade. I would have been 7 in first grade. So, I was at a friend's house. It was a New Year's Eve party. My parents were friends with this kid's parents, so we were hanging out, and they had a Nintendo. We did not at the time. If we wanted to play Nintendo games, we had to rent it from the local Bogarts. I don't even know if Bogarts is even still a thing. and we could rent video games for the weekend. That was how we got to experience NES for the longest time. But anyways, my friend had one, and he was letting us try different games, and one of the games he let me play was The Legend of Zelda. And at first, I had mixed feelings right off the bat. I liked it was an overhead, a top-down look that was different than your typical standard side-scroller, which I thought was different and unique compared to most games I had played on the NES up to that point. And it was kind of, you had a sword. It was kind of medieval fantasy themed, which appealed to me. I thought it was pretty neat. It has some, magic items and monsters and stuff like that. But also, it was very difficult. It was a very hard game. And, without the map and the instruction book and everything else, if you're just playing it blind, a blind playthrough, you don't know what the fuck you're supposed to do. And it's an incredibly difficult and cryptic game if you don't know what you're supposed to do. Now, at this point in time, there's been so many walkthroughs and YouTube videos and sequels and remakes and everything else that it's like, most gamers today just know what to do because it's like, we're bombarded with Legend of Zelda today. So there's no mystery, really. You might need a strategy guide or, assistance solving some of the more complicated puzzles or, knowing which order to tackle the dungeons and also how to find certain dungeons, because some of them are hidden. Some of them are well hidden. But back in the day, we didn't have that. And so my initial impression was the game was fine. I enjoyed it. I liked it. But it was too hard for me, so I didn't enjoy playing it. I was fine watching my friend play, but I didn't want to really play it myself at first. I was like, nah, this game's too hard. I want to say a year or two later, we actually ended up getting an NES for Christmas. And no, we did not, spoilers, did not get The Legend of Zelda. It came bundled with the Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt cartridge because that was the standard cartridge at the time that came with your NES console. And my parents bought us a handful of used video games. We had we had Friday the 13th, the video game. We had a Japanese game called Xexyz, Xexyz. And we had the Three Stooges, and that was about it. Growing up, we didn't have a ton of games. As time went on, the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis came on the scene. NES games became incredibly inexpensive. It was very easy to find NES games at yard sales and flea markets and thrift stores for like $1 or $2. So after I got my Sega Genesis, I started collecting or going after some of the NES games I didn't get to play when the NES was still, the it thing. And one of my friends, when I was in 6th grade, this is, like I said, a few years later, he had a copy of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, which he let me play. I would go to his house and he would let me play that game. This is where I'm going to piss off a lot of people. I liked it better than the first Zelda. I was like, hey, this is fun. I actually like this. It wasn't as hard as the first Zelda. Wasn't as cryptic as the first Zelda. It had a more fleshed out leveling up system and a more fleshed out magic system. It was more akin to a traditional role-playing game, which computer video game RPG I had not played or experienced up to this point yet. But I had already discovered Dungeons & Dragons, Advanced D&D 2nd Edition, that I was playing with my friends also in school, 6th grade. So I was starting to develop an appreciation for that style of gameplay. You know, collecting experience points, leveling up, using magic spells, etc. I liked Zelda 2 a little bit better than Zelda 1, initially. Also, between discovering Zelda and getting to play Zelda 2 at my friend's house about 4 or 5 years later, if I'm doing my math correctly, I'd already experienced the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, which on Friday, the Mario cartoon turned into a Zelda cartoon. So I already was sort of becoming versed in the Zelda lore outside of the video games. I did not have a Game Boy back in the day. We'll talk about the Game Boy game here in a minute. But in my timeline, at this point, I was starting to think Zelda 2 was more my speed. So, I ended up buying a used copy of both The Legend of Zelda Gold cartridge and Zelda 2 The Adventure of Link. And I believe it was also a gold cartridge, if I'm not mistaken. And so I would go back and forth and play a little bit of Zelda, get frustrated, turn it off. Well, save and then turn it off, because it had a save feature, which was wonderful. And then play a little bit of Zelda 2. In 1996, the day the Nintendo 64 came out, I had just bought one from Kmart. I found a Super Nintendo in a shoebox full of games at a pawn shop and a drum set that I wanted. So I took the N64 back to the Kmart, got my money back, went back to the pawn shop, got the drum set, got this SNES, and one of the games that was in the shoebox was The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. At first, I was very impressed with the graphics. I thought this is a really good-looking game. And I was also impressed with the gameplay. It was more reminiscent of the original Zelda than Zelda 2, so I felt like, in a way, it took a step back. But I was okay with it because, like I said, the graphics were impressive, the music was impressive. The game was fun, and it wasn't too terribly difficult compared to the NES versions. Now, there were a couple of parts that were tricky, that fortunately I had a friend who had already beat the game more than once at school that I could ask, hey, I'm at this part, what do I do? And my friend would tell me what to do. So I was able to get through A Link to the Past relatively quickly, making it the third video game in my entire life I beat, and the only Zelda game in the entire franchise to date that I have beat. Well, I take that back. No, I take that back, because I did beat the NES Zelda once without using cheats, but I was using an emulator and strategy guides, but I'll still, fine, whatever. But this one I beat on my own, just the actual cartridge. I loved A Link to the Past. I was impressed. I was like, I want more games like this. Eventually, I got more games like it, sort of. I got Phantasy Star 4 on the Sega Genesis, Shining Force on the Sega Genesis, and the beloved, ever-popular Final Fantasy 3 on the SNES. ...2001 rolls around. I'm now 18. I have a job. I got a paycheck. It's my birthday. My 18th birthday. I took my first paycheck from my job. with money that my parents gave me, birthday money that my parents gave me, went to the mall at the used video game store that today is a GameStop, but it wasn't back then. I believe it was Software Etc. back then. And I bought 2 game consoles on my 18th birthday. I bought a Nintendo 64, and I bought a Sony PlayStation. Very first game I got on the PlayStation, Final Fantasy VII. Very first game I got on the Nintendo 64, Super Mario 64, obviously. But that same school year, my next door neighbor, who was also my best friend, had an N64, and he had a copy of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, which he lent me both. I started with Ocarina of Time. This time, I had mixed feelings. I was very impressed with the 3D graphics and the gameplay at the time, you know. I was very impressed with how open world it was, how big the world was, so much to explore. But I had an unrealistic expectation. I had assumed, and I don't know why I assumed this, but maybe it was reading a magazine, maybe it was the commercial or something, I don't know. But I had assumed Ocarina of Time was basically a 3D remake of A Link to the Past, because A Link to the Past is basically a 3D remake of the original Legend of Zelda. Sort of a retelling of the same game, the same story, with just a little more oomph added to it, but that's not the case. Ocarina of Time was a completely different story. I would years later find out that A Link to the Past was not a straight up remake of the original Legend of Zelda. It was actually another game in the same timeline, or a different I don't know. The timeline's confusing. We don't talk about it. I was mostly having fun with Ocarina of Time. It was the controls were a little tricky for me. I was still getting used to 3D movement. The Navi was, Navi or whatever the fuck her name is, was obnoxious annoying. Every she was like, hey, listen! I wanted to throw the controller at the TV and say, shut the fuck up, bitch. She was so obnoxious. But overall, I had a lot of fun with the game, even though it was realistically beyond my skill set. I didn't get very far in the game. I honestly, it's so long ago, I couldn't tell you how far I got. I don't remember. I know I beat the tree. I know I did the level with the dungeon with the rocks, the rock people, whatever the fuck they're called. But I don't remember anything beyond that. I don't know how far I got. Eventually I got frustrated and gave up. I told my friend this, my next door neighbor, and he's like, oh no, you gotta try Majora's Mask, it's so much better. He was full of shit. Not only was it not better, it was, to this day, not only the worst Zelda game I've ever played, second worst Nintendo 64 game I've ever played. But this was the start of where I started to lose interest in the Zelda franchise. I was starting to realize that if they're just going to remake the same fucking game every 5 years, I'm out. Which is not 100% what they did, but it's like 70% what they did. Every Zelda game is 70% the last Zelda game you've played. The other 30% is the new gimmick that they introduce. And yeah, it's the same dungeons, they just rearrange them. It's the same puzzles, they just try to mix it up so that to keep you on your toes. But it's basically the same fucking game over and over and over. I can't complain too much because you could say the same thing about Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat or even the Mario franchise, more or less. Okay, definitely Mega Man. I think they just slap a new sticker on Mega Man and then just put it back out every year after year. It's the same fucking game. Anyways, I did not enjoy Majora's Mask, so I went back to Ocarina of Time, but at this point, I had really shifted most of my gameplay to Mario 64, Mortal Kombat Trilogy, Nightmare Creatures, which is a surprisingly good game considering it's got clunky controls, and the aforementioned Final Fantasy VII, which I beat to 100%. Very first game I ever got 100% on. I was obsessed with Final Fantasy VII. Now, I don't know if it was just a mixture of unrealistic expectations because of how great Final Fantasy VII was. The fact that Zelda quickly abandoned any role-playing game elements, cementing itself as an action-adventure franchise, not an RPG franchise. Or if it was just my, changing tastes. I don't know what it was, but I just was having a hard time finishing Ocarina of Time. But at this point, I did acquire a Game Boy Advance and a GameCube. And I had, my GameCube came with, I bought it, and when I bought it, it came with bundled. I bought it used, so I know this wasn't an official retail bundle, but the store I bought it from bundled it with the Legend of Zelda Collector's Disc, which included the 8-bit NES ROMs for the Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2, The Link to the Past, as well as, or Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, as well as the N64 ROMs, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. I'm getting tongue-tied. And a 15-minute playable demo for the Wind Waker. So I bought the Wind Waker. Now, unlike most people, I did not see the Space World 2000 video. I had no knowledge of the mature Link that everybody was bitching about. My first experience with Wind Waker was that playable demo. I thought the game was beautiful. I loved the 2D graphics. I thought it was a gorgeous looking game. So I bought it. And I was immediately pissed off that I bought it. Not because of the graphics or anything, but just because it wasn't a Zelda game. Or at least not initially. I know if you put 2+ hours into it and you solve the first, dungeon and the first slew of puzzles and you sail the ship and you escape the island, eventually it turns into a Zelda game. I didn't have the patience for that. It was little kid Link running around the island chasing birds and running from his obnoxious neighbor with snot pouring out of his nose. Ugh, I gagged today even thinking about it. A little sister that was obnoxious and annoying. And then somehow you find yourself on a pirate ship and I'm like, nothing about this is anything related to Zelda. So I could have been, okay, cool, they mixed it up. Something original, fresh, unique. Instead, I went this doesn't play like what I'm used to, I don't like it. So I abandoned Wind Waker early on. But at this time, I also had a Game Boy Advance, which is fully backwards compatible with Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. So I picked up Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons and the Minish Cap. Played an hour or so of each of the Oracle games, got bored, got really far into the Minish Cap, and then my save became corrupted, and then I couldn't finish the game, and then I was angry. And so I traded the game into the game store, and I was like, yeah, this game's broken, I don't want it. But I was still a huge GameCube nut. I loved the GameCube. I was fully immersed in the GameCube. I was reading regular Nintendo articles online. I'm not going to name the websites because one of them I was a regular member of. Let's just say I've had a falling out with that community, and I will not name them because I don't want to give them any publicity. But I was hyped for the upcoming Nintendo Wii, at the time known as the Revolution. Stood in line to buy my Wii on day one. Was the only person standing in line to buy my Wii because I went to Kmart to buy my Wii and nobody else did. Everybody else went to Best Buy or Target. We didn't have a Walmart at that time in our town. And yes, one of the not the literal first game, but within the launch window, one of the first games I got was The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. I really liked Twilight Princess so much more than Wind Waker, and infinitely more than Majora's Mask. But I had trouble with the motion controls. I wasn't very good at it, and it was frustrating, and after a while I got lazy and didn't want to play the game anymore because I was like, I'm tired. I just want to hold the controller in my lap and push buttons. I don't want to be dancing around like a jackass anymore. So eventually, I got rid of the Wii version and picked up even at the time, more expensive GameCube version. And tried that one out. Likewise, got pretty far. Midway through the Wii generation, around 2008, 2009, somewhere in that ballpark, I got fed up with the Wii. And I sold it. I sold my Wii. Got rid of it all. I did have a Nintendo DS at the time, which I traded into GameStop, because that game store was now owned by GameStop and had rebranded by this time. And ended up buying a DS Lite because it was smaller and less expensive and, had better battery life, etc. But I didn't play any of the Zelda games on the DS. I just skipped those entirely. I skipped Skyward Sword, so I have no experience with Skyward Sword. In 2013, I ended up buying a Wii U. And I'm just going to tell you right now, I bought it to play Super Mario 3D World and The Legend of Zelda, or not The Legend of Zelda, Hyrule Warriors, basically, which is a hack and slash game in the Zelda universe. I love the shit out of Hyrule Warriors. To me, I was like, yes, if you're going to do something different with Zelda, this is what you do. I enjoyed it. I loved it. I was all in on Hyrule Warriors. And then Nintendo saw fit to re-release a couple of their previous Zelda console games as HD remakes for the Wii U. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I was all in on the Wii U. It was my dedicated home console, which meant if you followed the Wii U back during its current gen status, there was not a whole hell of a lot of goddamn games to play on the motherfucking thing. You'd get one game every 3 months if you are fucking lucky. In between, you were just supposed to rebuy all of the Virtual Console games you already bought on the Wii, and I was not happy about that. So, while every game that came out on the Wii U was aces and were well worth my time, they were so few and far between. I was desperate for games to play. I ended up buying Twilight Princess HD Remake and the Wind Waker HD Remake. This time around, I was a little less harsh on the Wind Waker. I gave it an honest chance, and I actually got off the island and got to the actual Zelda part of the game, and had a lot of fun with it. I tried to get into Twilight Princess, but by this point, I didn't want to start over, because I got pretty far previously, and I'd already started over before when I switched from the Wii to the GameCube, so I was like, I'm not starting it a third time. So that was basically a game I bought just to put on the shelf, to have in my collection. I didn't really play Twilight Princess, because I'd already played it enough. Fast forward one final time, I stood in line at GameStop to pre-order a Nintendo Switch this time around, because I was hyped for the Nintendo Switch. I couldn't wait to get my hands on it. Got it on launch day. Took it home. Very first game I played, The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. And I loved every fucking minute of it. I couldn't believe it. It was finally a fresh Zelda game that made me enjoy the franchise again. It was infinitely better than Ocarina of Time. Infinitely better than Majora's Mask. On par with Twilight Princess, but better in some ways, not as good in other ways, but on par overall. And a little more accessible than Wind Waker. Again, I never played Skyward Sword, and the handheld games I had just mentioned were the only handheld Zeldas I've ever played. I've never played the Game Boy one, what's it called, Link's Awakening, or A Link Between Worlds, never played it. Never owned a 3DS. However, I had gone through the drought of the Nintendo 64. I had lived through the drought of the GameCube. The frustration of seeing a game announced, getting excited, I want to play that game, and then it not coming to the Nintendo console. I did it again with the Wii. I did it again with the Wii U. Finally, when the Switch rolled around, I was fed up and I was done. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to fucking buy a PlayStation. So I got a PS3 and a PS4, and I said, fine, I'll still play Nintendo for the Nintendo shit, but I've got to have a PlayStation to get all the games I'm missing out on that I'm getting angry that aren't coming to Nintendo, and they're never going to fucking come to Nintendo except for maybe 10 to 15 years later as some sort of HD remaster. I got tired of waiting 15 years to play a game everybody else got to play, a long ass fucking time ago. I got fed up with it. Well, long story short, I sold my Switch, but I sold all my consoles. The only ones I kept were my PS3 and my PS4. I sold everything else. The GameCube, the SNES, the Genesis, the N64, everything. I sold it all. Except for the Wii U. I didn't sell the Wii U because that goddamn thing got stolen. Fucking asshole. I lost my job. I had to pay rent. This was right smack dab in the middle of fucking COVID. Unemployment benefits was not going to pay rent. It was barely enough to fucking pay my power bill. So I got desperate. Ended up selling my house and moved in with a friend in Dallas and started over. Started fresh. With 0 games except for Minecraft and a handful of games on the PS4. You probably already know this, but there are no Zelda games on the PlayStation. So, Breath of the Wild was the last Zelda game I played. I, overall, despite some animosity towards Nintendo and some of their bullshit practices, I still consider myself a Nintendo fan. I still love their games as a whole. I take incredible issues with the vast majority of their hardware decisions, because they're always making bullshit decisions that are going to limit their ability to get third-party partners on board with their system. It is what it is. If I had the money, I would definitely buy a Switch, and I would buy Breath of the Wild again. And I would definitely consider, and I can't remember what it's called, the sequel to Breath of the Wild, I'll say. I don't remember what it's called, I apologize. I would definitely consider buying that if I owned a Switch. I did have fun overall with the Zelda games I played. Even though I've only technically beat 2 of them. The original NES Zelda and A Link to the Past on the SNES. A Link to the Past being the only one I beat legitimately on a cartridge on the actual system, and the original Zelda I beat on an emulator using the ROM. So it was like, yeah, I kind of cheated using save states, even though you can save, but it was like, yeah. So I beat it, but I didn't beat it properly, if you will. But anyways, as a franchise, I love Zelda. I think Zelda is a wonderful story. It's a very rich world to explore, and I love the exploration aspect, and I love the dungeon crawling and the hack and slash aspect of Zelda. I'm a little disappointed that they introduced proper RPG elements with Zelda 2, and then immediately backtracked going forward and have had bare minimal RPG elements in every Zelda going forward. I'm a little disappointed in that because Zelda could have been Nintendo's big JRPG. But instead, they took it in a different direction and made it their big action-adventure game, which there's nothing wrong with it. It just sort of left their console kind of lacking in the RPG realm, even to this day. The Switch has probably got the most RPGs of a Nintendo console, proper RPGs, since the SNES. The N64 had one, literally one. Unless you count the turn-based strategy game Ogre Mage or whatever it was called. Then it had kind of two. The GameCube had a handful. The Wii had maybe a few. The Wii U, as far as I know, had Xenoblade, and that's it. I don't think it had very many proper RPGs. But the Switch looks like it did, so, you know. Overall, as a whole, I am a fan of JRPGs and Western RPGs. I like role-playing games. I tend to prefer the dungeon-exploring hack-and-slash RPGs to the, the turn-based anime style, because I'm not a fan of anime. But I still enjoy a lot of JRPGs and a lot of Western RPGs, action RPGs, etc. It's not my go-to genre, but it's one of the genres I'm more open to than like first-person shooters or open-world sandbox Grand Theft Auto bullshit games. Which takes me back to Breath of the Wild. I was somewhat disappointed in its, not in the open world aspect. I enjoyed that. I was like, good, something fresh. I was disappointed in its overall lack of proper fleshed out dungeons. It has, like, I don't even know what they're called. They're pseudo dungeons, but they're not even. It's like 2 room. You solve one puzzle, you get a item or whatever. You don't even get a quest item. You get like a crystal or something. I don't remember. It was a totally different experience than what I was used to. I didn't hate it, but it was just different. And that's where I am today with the Legend of Zelda franchise. Yeah. Stay cool.